Welcome. We're glad that you've joined us today for this webinar on the draft Reduction of Chemicals of Concern criteria for the EPEAT Eco-Label. Patty Dillon, GEC's Vice President for Category and Criteria Development, is unfortunately unable to join us today. But I'm Erica Logan, Director of Sustainable Criteria Development at the Global Electronics Council. Last week, GEC released its draft criteria on reduction of chemicals of concern for a 60-day public comment period. On the webinar today, we're excited to share with you an overview of the draft criteria and the rationale behind the criteria. We'll also give you a quick tutorial on how to submit comments and answer questions about the criteria and comment process. Before we get started, just a couple of logistical items. First, the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available following the webinar. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. The slide deck will also be made available. Everyone is on mute today to reduce background noise. If you have questions, we ask that you type them into the questions window on the GoToWebinar dashboard. We will hold questions to the end of the presentations to make sure we have enough time to get through all the content. If we don't get to respond to your questions during the webinar, we will respond by email afterwards. Next slide, please. Joining me today on today's call are Rachel Simon, Jessica Evans, and Greta Barger. Rachel is Senior Manager for Criteria Development at GEC. She's a project lead for developing criteria for the sustainability impact modules, including reduction of chemicals of concern. Rachel has been with GEC for just over a year now. Before coming to GEC, she worked with various industries to measure and make more informed decisions around the human health and environmental impacts of chemicals, materials, and products. We're pleased to also have with us today on today's webinar NSF International, who is GEC's partner in developing criteria for the sustainability impact modules. Jessica is the director of the standards development team at NSF International, overseeing all of NSF's standard development efforts. Jessica and her team facilitate the development and maintenance of more than 80 NSF ANSI standards and approximately 70 additional protocols in the areas of food, water, sustainability, and health sciences. Greta is the sustainability standards lead at NSF, working on developing sustainability criteria in partnership with GEC. Prior to joining NSF, Greta worked as a sustainability analyst at Steelcase, where she gained extensive experience supporting the company's sustainability objectives. Next slide, please. So for our agenda, on today's call, we will cover an overview of GEC's criteria development process, reduction of chemicals of concern, state of sustainability research highlights, an overview of the reduction of chemicals of concern draft criteria, information on how to participate in the public comment process, and next steps. And we'll save time for questions and answers with our full panel. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the draft criteria, I wanted to provide a quick overview of GEC's new criteria development process, which we are now using to develop criteria for the EPEAT program. I want to highlight two fundamental changes in our process that are important context for the draft criteria that we'll be reviewing today. The EPEAT program launched in 2006 with just one product category, hard to believe, computers and displays, and has now grown to over 7 product categories, 6 ICT product categories plus photovoltaic modules. Currently, each product category has its own set of criteria and revision cycle, which is inefficient for all stakeholders. whether it's when participating in criteria development and maintenance, or if you're a participating manufacturer or a conformity assurance body working to meet and verify the criteria. Next slide, please. In GEC's new criteria development process, we are creating horizontal criteria focused on priority sustainability impacts that will apply across all EPEAT product categories, starting with ICT products. There are 4 sustainability impact modules, including Climate Change Mitigation, shown on the top left in green, which covers topics such as energy efficiency and renewable electricity sourcing. And then going clockwise, our sustainable use of resources, or circularity, is in blue. Corporate ESG Performance in purple. That's a big S in the ESG, as the initial focus is largely on labor practices, social supply chain auditing, and transparency. And then finally, reduction of chemicals of concern in red, the subject of today's webinar. Each of these modules is a separate criteria development process. These modular criteria will be supplemented by product-specific criteria, but only in limited cases. So for example, criteria focused on toner and ink cartridges only apply to imaging equipment. These criteria are not covered in the modules and will be developed in a separate process. Next slide, please. Each of the sustainability impact modules is being developed using GEC's new criteria development process. EPEAT is now a recognized Type 1 eco-label. This new process was designed to align with the requirements of ISO 14024 for Type 1 eco-labels, and to maintain GEC's commitment to developing criteria within a voluntary consensus process, which is important to many of our stakeholders. The process starts with state of sustainability research, which lays out the science and the evidence to support criteria development. The research looks at sustainability impacts across the life cycle of the product, as well as strategies and best practices to mitigate the identified impacts, leading to recommendations for criteria. The state of sustainability research is open for public comment for 60 days. It's then revised as needed based on comments and any additional data submitted and published. May, if you can hit return. Or no, stay on the same slide, but just yeah, there we go, for a little bit of animation. For the reduction of chemicals of concern, the state of sustainability research went out for public consultation last winter, and the final version shown here was published in February 2022. It's available on the GEC website. In a few minutes, Rachel will touch on some highlights from the research, but I encourage you to read the report as it really does contain a wealth of information. Based on the impacts and mitigation strategies identified in that state of sustainability research, criteria drafting begins. Draft criteria may originate from different sources, including existing EPEAT criteria, if it's available, if it still represents leadership, and it could be with or without modifications. GEC staff or partner organizations may draft criteria, and we also welcome submissions from stakeholders. GEC then puts out a call for participation and forms expert ad hoc groups that provide technical feedback on the draft criteria, and if needed, draft additional criteria. For the reduction of chemicals of concern module, we had 5 expert ad hoc groups working on different criteria topics, which align with each section of the criteria document. And May, if there's one more, if you could hit return, there's one more animation there. There it is. All the draft criteria are then compiled into a full draft criteria document, which is essentially a standard. And it's delivered to a technical committee, which is the consensus body that will deliberate on the criteria, modify as needed, and ultimately approve the criteria by consensus. At this point in time, the draft criteria are also made available for public comment. And that's where we are in this process right now. The technical committee will consider public comments in their deliberations as well. And the final step in the process is for EPEAT to adopt the criteria resulting from the voluntary consensus process. To qualify for EPEAT, a product will need to meet all required criteria in the 4 sustainability impact modules that are applicable to that product. If you want to dive deeper into the process, you can download GEC's procedure from our website using the link shown here. We call it P74. Next slide, please. So principles for criteria development. When reviewing and commenting on criteria, we ask both the technical committee and public commenters to take into account the following 6 principles. Number 1, criteria must address priority sustainability impacts across the product lifecycle as identified in the State of Sustainability Research. Second, criteria should establish baseline leadership through required criteria, but also incentivize continuous improvement and innovation through the use of optional criteria. Criteria are to be given due consideration to life cycle trade-offs and the ability of the market to meet the criteria in a reasonable time frame. Criteria should differentiate environmentally and socially preferable products from others in the marketplace. Criteria align with internationally recognized best practices. And super important, number 6, not that the others aren't important as well, but it must be possible for the requirements to be independently verified through objective measures. Next slide, please. So just a bit about implementation before I turn it over to Rachel. So EPEAT is in the process of preparing a more detailed timeline that will include discrete activities such as training, when the registry will open to manufacturers and cabs versus purchasers, when all products on the registry must meet the new criteria, and so forth. And to inform preparation of that implementation plan, they're in the process of hosting several stakeholder meetings to solicit feedback. That effort will continue over the summer, and as such, a final plan is expected by this fall. Please note that the modules will be implemented in 2 phases. Phase 1 will be for product categories launched prior to 2020. So that includes computers and displays, imaging equipment, mobile phones, servers, and televisions. Phase 2 will be for product categories launched after 2020. So that includes network equipment and might include photovoltaics or aspects thereof. And then while not shown on this slide, the timeline for wearables devices is expected to align most closely with phase 1. Next slide, please. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Rachel Simon, who will dive into the state of sustainability research and the draft criteria. Rachel?
Thank you, Erica. So before we get into the reduction of chemicals of concern criteria, I'll give a high-level overview of the information in the State of Sustainability Research, which, as Erica mentioned, serves as the foundation of our criteria development process. So why are chemicals of concern one of our 4 modules? Well, the electronics industry currently relies on chemicals with known or reasonable risks to human health and the environment, and these chemicals impact people throughout the supply chain, including workers, users, recyclers, and communities. These chemicals are pervasive. They're found in people, animals, and the environment, and they can persist in the environment after release and accumulate in organisms transferring up the food chain. And finally, e-waste contains over 1,000 chemicals and is the fastest growing waste stream on the planet, with millions of devices discarded every year. And unfortunately, the collection and recycle rates for global e-waste were relatively low at 17.4% in 2018. So those are some of the reasons why we're focusing on these chemicals of concern and reducing them throughout the supply chain. On the next slide, I'll start by noting that the EPEAT criteria has historically evolved to integrate the hazards-based approach to addressing chemicals of concern. So the state of sustainability research focus on substances whose intrinsic properties have the potential to cause harm to people or the environment based on their structure. In addition, we look at minimizing the risk of exposure to such chemicals through manufacturing process controls. Therefore, much of the research focused on and is organized by functional classes of chemicals, where the science provides evidence that the chemicals of similar structures are likely to have similar hazard characteristics. We also take a life cycle perspective, and while most hazardous chemicals have the potential to affect all stakeholders along the supply chain, the research discusses how key stakeholders along the life cycle may be exposed to certain types of chemicals to demonstrate the breadth of issues with such chemicals. In the next slide, we see that the research in the state of sustainability research discusses the complexities of mapping historic worker health issues to chemical management. Given that the technology and the chemicals used to create it is always changing, the industry is highly competitive, wanting to protect confidential information, that workers are exposed to numerous chemicals, therefore making it hard to identify any particular chemical that may have caused an impact, and that the hazard profile of subchemicals is not known. However, in the research, we do note some chemical substances with known issues. So for instance, the research discusses the potential of phthalates and brominated and chlorinated flame retardants to migrate out of materials into indoor dust, exposing users to the risk of various health impacts. And then the research also discusses the potential to exacerbate issues of those substances at the end of life, with the creation of furans and dioxides from the combustion of brominated and chlorinated substances, exposing numerous stakeholders across the supply chain and the value chain. We also discuss the potential impacts of hazardous metals and focus in on the impacts to workers during extraction and material processing. Several of the concerns associated with workers are from respiratory issues and respiratory routes of exposures to some of these metals, where there's high probability for dust or fumes exposure. So this is just some of the issues that were addressed in the state of sustainability research. In addition to these issues, we discussed mitigation strategies to address the issues associated with these chemicals of concern. In the simplest terms, these include restricting chemicals known to be problematic and switching to safer alternatives. However, there are barriers to achieving these, including knowledge of which chemicals are in products and also their potential replacements. So we have a lack of hazard data. We have another barrier is the time between exposure and the health impact showing up in the workers, making it challenging to minimize their impacts. Also, there's a lack of information, as I mentioned, in what's in products. So for instance, in one study from the semiconductor industry, which we noted in the state of sustainability research, it took on average 8 years before workers developed symptoms related to their exposure. And then in another study, it was noted that given how competitive the semiconductor industry is, between 14 and 56% of chemical products contain trade secret ingredients. And then for the photolithography process in particular, it was over 90% confidential information. So those are those barriers that prevent knowing what chemicals to restrict, because knowledge about what chemicals may be there is limited. There's also barriers to adopting safer replacements, including regrettable substitutes, where removing the chemical of concern, it is replaced with one that is also problematic. And then also the manufacturer's ability to collaborate with their supply chain to make necessary changes. So given these barriers, on the next slide, we'll see that moving forward towards safer alternatives, there are additional mitigation strategies that we cover in the state of sustainability research, including transparency or knowing what chemicals are present, collecting more hazard data information for confidential content, and assessing the chemical hazards of known substances as part of an alternatives assessment process for chemical replacement, so also assessing what might go in as well. So that's a very brief overview of what's in the state of sustainability research. I encourage you to look at it to see the full breadth of information there. As again, I mentioned earlier, it serves as the foundation for the criteria development process. So now we'll dig into the reduction of chemical of concern criteria. So before we get into the criteria, on the next slide, you'll see that while some of you are very familiar with the EPEAT process, some of you may be a little less familiar with the way the eco-label works. So coming up, I'll be discussing criteria which is required and optional. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background to make sure that we all have a common understanding. So EPEAT is a tiered eco-label. So that means that it has the different levels of bronze, silver, and gold, and it's intended to spur innovation and meet markets. So for a product to even get on the registry, it must meet all of the required criteria, and that gives it the bronze status. And then for it to be considered for silver, it must meet 50% of the optional criteria on top of all of those that are required. And then to meet gold, it must meet 75% of the optional criteria, again, in addition to all of the required criteria. So those are the tiers of the EPEAT eco-label and its relationship to the required and optional criteria. So the criteria itself, there are 22 proposed criteria, 9 are required and 14 are optional. The first set is on the management of substances used in products. There are 9 of those that focus on minimizing or eliminating the use of key substances of concern in products through robust chemical management. The second set is substance inventory and transparency. There are 5 of those criteria, which encourages better understanding of the chemicals used within products and processes through chemical inventorying and disclosure. The next set is on alternatives assessment for chemicals of concern and public disclosure. 3 of those, promoting the use of chemical hazards assessment as a methodology to find safer substitutes for chemicals of concern. The next set is manufacturing process chemicals. There are 2 criteria there, which focus on understanding and reducing chemicals with high hazard impacts used in manufacturing processes. And the last set are focused on the reduction of substances of concern in packaging. 3 of those criteria focus on reducing key chemicals of concern through evaluation and restriction of use in packaging. So about half of the criteria for the management of substances used in products leverages existing EPEAT criteria, and it's mostly based on EU policies such as ROS, the Battery Directive, and various elements of REACH to standardize the language across the criteria for ICT product categories. So so that's the first 4 criteria. 6.1.5 and 6 also standardized language across the product categories for bromine and chlorine reductions, elevating the scope for imaging equipment and televisions where the criteria had not been as robust as for computers and displays and other product categories. The 7th criteria in this set is a new criterion, and it focuses on total fluorine as an indicator for PFAS in plastic parts. The 8th criteria expands on existing beryllium reductions from the computers and displays product category and implements it to other product categories as an optional criteria. And then the last is a criteria for the consideration of prolonged skin contact chemicals, which builds off the nickel restriction is in the existing mobile phone standard and also leverages the work being done by the wearables group currently in process. For the substance inventory and transparency, it also leverages EPEAT criteria to align with best practices on the premise that knowledge is the foundation for shifting to safer chemicals. 2 criteria are based on IEC 62474, the material declaration for products and for the electrotechnical industry, evaluating the requirements to collect information. So looking at the EPEAT registry, we also wanted to leverage criteria that had been used previously on requesting information and gathering information. So full material disclosures is an evolving best practice that allows for informed management of any chemical of concern. In the computers and displays, we found that 54% of registered products had requested the information, 3% had gathered it for 75% more or the max, and 41% had collected the inventory for 90% or more of the mass. So there is still, it is demonstrating leadership to collect this information, but there's still room for improvement across the product categories and also for those that don't already have this criteria. And transparency allows for stakeholders to make informed decisions, from product designers to purchasers, creating benchmarks against which to measure progress towards safer chemical solutions. So given the importance of this criteria, these elevate the criteria by requesting this information across all product categories. Next is the alternatives assessment for chemicals of concern and public disclosure. This leverages existing EPEAT criteria from servers and computers and displays. It elevates the criteria focused on finding safer alternatives for key chemical functions of flame retardants and plasticizers for all the product categories. It also expands the scope with a new criteria focused on the development and adoption of alternatives for PFAS in electronics. New criteria also incentivizes the sharing of comparative hazard data with the goal of providing stakeholders with more information on alternatives to chemicals of concern. The next set of criteria on manufacturing process chemicals are new to EPEAT. So regardless of the manufacturer's size, structure, or clout, these criteria depend on manufacturers deepening their relationships with their suppliers. One criteria focuses on reducing high priority process chemicals through a program. The criterion includes details on how to identify these high priority chemicals based on their hazards and likelihood of use, what facilities are in scope, 15 for this one, and the responsibility of the program, including annual reporting and supplier requirements. The other criteria is focused on a process to collect that information used in the manufacturing of products, and includes what facilities are in scope and what particular information needs to be collected, including the means to collect it through a tool and the specific data such as the chemical name, the task number, facility information, and associated processes, quantities, and controls. Our last set of criteria, which there are 3 of them, focus on the reduction of substances of concern in packaging, and it leverages existing criteria from across all product categories on heavy metals and chlorine. It expands requirements to address additional chemicals of concern in packaging, aligning with sustainable demands for packaging for the removal of phthalates, PFAS, and PVC. It also incentivizes moving away from bleaching with fluorine compounds. So those are the reduction of chemical of concern criteria, all of the various sets of criteria for the 5 categories. Before moving on to talk about the public comment process, if you could go back one. I wanted to just note that we have new terminology throughout all of our 4 modules. Criteria that are at the product level and the product category level and the corporation level. So the product level means that the evidence is provided to support conformance to this criteria is for individual EPEAT registered products. The product category level means that it's provided, that support is conformance is provided for individual product categories, and manufacturers may indicate if the evidence submitted addresses multiple product categories. And lastly, the corporation level means that the evidence provided for conformance with the criteria is at the organizational level and must be met for all product categories for which the manufacturer registers products. And I bring this up because this is also included in the criteria and will help with the interpretation of the verification requirements. So thank you all for your time. Now I will turn it over to Jess and Greta to talk about the public comment period.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. I am going to talk a little bit in more detail about the public comment process. So next slide, please. All right, so the public comment period of this process is extremely important as we collect additional feedback and thoughts from stakeholders that haven't been involved up to this point in all of the incredible work that Rachel just outlined on the drafting of the content. So this is open to all interested parties and persons directly impacted by the criteria itself. As I believe Erica mentioned, the comment period did open last Wednesday, July 13th, and will run through to the end of the day on September 12th. This public comment period runs concurrently with the balloting process with the technical committee. And what we will do is, in the end, compile all of the feedback that we've received both from public commenters and the technical committee members, and that will shape our discussions in the months to come. So all of the agenda items will be built on the feedback that has gone forward. It'll be put into buckets. So it really is a focused approach to addressing and considering all of the feedback that we've received both from the technical committee and public commenters as well. As you can imagine, there will be a lot of feedback that will be collected. And in the end of the process, what we will do is we will compile all of that and put together a final summary and report out. And what that will consider will be the comment itself and then the resolution and the action that is taken to address those comments. So it will be a full report that will be viewed by anyone that is interested, and will be posted on the NSF online workspace. It's important to note that in this final report and throughout the commenting process, each individual comment will be attributed to the organization and the individual that has submitted the comment. So please take that into consideration when you are submitting your feedback. Once this webinar completes today, we will share the deck that we've used throughout our discussions. And as you can see in the final bullet, there's a direct link to review the content and provide your comments. So now I'd like to turn it over to Greta to kind of go into detail about how you go about submitting your feedback.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, hi everyone. Just want to walk through the logistical steps that you'll follow to submit a public comment. So if you follow the link on the last slide, or I think it's in the chat for you now too, you'll land on a page that looks like this. So you'll be able to download the full draft criteria document from that PDF link there. And then any steps that I go through today are noted there in the description as well. So a little bit of instructions on that page. But to submit a comment, you'll want to navigate up to the upper left and click on the small add a comment link. And on the next slide, you'll see the next page that you'll follow too. So just the first part, basic personal information that you'll fill out, like Jessica said, it's all publicly available comments that are attributed to the person who submitted them. So to get started, you'll input your personal information. And then next, you'll land into the main content of submitting a comment. So here you'll find required to complete the subject of your comment as well as the comment itself. You can fill in category, section, and item, and they're not required, but the more specific, the better in identifying where a comment relates to. And then finally, in the proposed solution section, it's not required, but it is vital when you are submitting a comment to suggest what you'd like to see. So this can be the best way to submit a proposed solution for a comment is to provide proposed language that you'd like to see in place of what is there. So as Jess said, we'll work through these comments and use them to structure the agendas and the discussions of the technical committee. And comments are much more applicable if they have a proposed solution with proposed language that you'd like to see changed and that the TC can consider, the technical committee can consider. One thing I do want to point out here too is that you can submit a supporting file if that feels relevant to your comment, and then please be sure to use the slider on the bottom. That's just a little stopgap to make sure that it's the person submitting it, and then that is what will illuminate the save and add another buttons there in the bottom left, and that's what will save your comment. The last thing I want to say about submitting comments, sorry, May, is that you can feel free to group them. It's tedious, I'm sure, to work through individual comments. So while the category section and item details help, if you would like to submit comments per section, say 6.5, and your comment breaks down comments on multiple criteria, and that's okay. Just be sure to put a corresponding proposed solution when you're grouping multiple comments into one submission. Thank you. Next slide, May. So in terms of next steps, the public comment process is open for 60 days, like Jessica said, July 13th till September 12th, and they'll end, the public comment period will close just before midnight on the 12th, so you have all day. There's another link to the NSF online platform to submitting comments, and then links available to all of the documents that we went through here today. Questions relating to the public comment period can be directed to me. That's my email there, so please feel free to reach out if you're having any troubles with the NSF online workspace and submitting comments, or if you just have questions as well. And then questions about the technical content of the criteria we went through can go to that criteria at globalelectronicscouncil.org. Thank you, and I think we can turn it back to Erica for questions.
Terrific. Just trying to come off of mute. Here we go. Thank you, Rachel, Jessica, and Greta. That was great. Really appreciate that. And as you said, now let's turn to questions. If you have questions, please go ahead and enter them into the questions window. We'll get to as many as we can. And I am taking a look, and I see one that is it's about the public consultation. So I think, Jess, I'm going to send this one over to you. I understand GEC will have a second public consultation period. How's that all going to work?
Great question. So this is a process improvement that we've made over the past few weeks that we're really excited about. So we focused today on the initiation of the first public comment period, which is a 60-day window that we're in right now. Over the next several months, we will be working through the feedback that we have received in that first phase of collecting comments. We anticipate that there is a good possibility that we'll be making significant changes to the content in response to that feedback. So what we listen to stakeholders and bringing thoughts forward on, how is that content going to be reviewed once those changes have been proposed. And so we've instituted a second public comment period that will be focused on the changes that were made, the changes that were made in the consideration and resolution of the feedback that we received in the first phase. So we will, of course, communicate that opportunity to attendees on this webinar, GEC's newsletter, NSF's website. So we'll make sure that you are notified when that second public comment period is open so that you're able to review the changes and comment accordingly.
Terrific. Thanks so much for that. I see another question here about the nature of the criteria. So Rachel, I'm going to send this one over to you. How do the chemicals criteria intersect with all the other modules, especially climate change and corporate ESG?
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, so the reduction of chemicals of concern criteria really illustrates how the four modules intersect with one another. Even though we have these discrete buckets, a lot of the concerns, the issues around sustainability do overlap. So the chemical module focuses on understanding the chemicals within products and those used in manufacturing processes, restricting those chemicals with known issues, and assessing the impacts of possible alternatives to phase out chemicals to make information about chemicals available to purchasers. So that doesn't mean that there are issues with chemicals associated with climate change mitigation. So for instance, there are additional chemical related criteria in that module on reducing fluorinated greenhouse gas emissions during manufacturing. An overview of this intersection is in the State of Sustainability Research. So again, I promote people downloading that and reviewing it to see how those intersect. In the Sustainable Use of Resources module and the Corporate ESG Performance module, there will also be criteria which leads to reducing the human health environmental impact of substances in a related way, such as incorporated recycled content or adopting responsible sourcing to reduce the harmful chemicals associated with extraction. So again, there's overlap, but these are focused on understanding the chemicals and restricting them within products and manufacturing processes.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. And there's another question here, which I think the response you just provided answered some elements here, but let me read this one and send this one over to you as well. What was the technical scientific basis for the required reduction in chemicals of concern, such as brominated flame retardants, chlorine, or phthalates? These three are very broad classifications.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the State of Sustainability Research includes a review of each of those chemical categories. There are nuances, which we don't have enough time to get into all of them. But I think it's important to note that during the criteria development process, that State of Sustainability Research is really the foundation to highlight the issues, but the technical expertise moves through the process. And so during the expert ad hoc groups, we got feedback on what particular chemicals we want to focus on, what the thresholds for those chemicals might be. So the details and the nuances of those chemicals of concern. And again, as I mentioned, when introducing the State of Sustainability Research, we tend to take a functional class approach to chemicals of concern so as to not run into the issue of regrettable substitutes. So where there is evidence and noted in the State of Sustainability Research that there is a likelihood that similar chemicals would cause similar issues, really focusing on trying to move away from those types of chemicals to ones that are safer.
Thank you for that, Rachel. This one is around implementation and timing. So I'm thinking maybe Greta and I can kind of tag team on this one. And it says, any sense of timing on when the second public comment on revisions to the criteria might happen, or is it too early to say at the moment? And the short answer is it's too early to say, but practically speaking, it will happen once the technical committee completes their work and is ready to ballot the full criteria document. But Greta, is that right? Please expand.
Yep, perfectly said. And I would just add to that the ability to participate or observe the process is open to people who are interested. And I think that's a good way to stay plugged into changes that are being made as they're being made. And then as we start to near the public comment process, you'll be very aware of when it will open. So
great, thank you for that, Greta. Rachel, you are lots of questions for you here, which is good. It means they were really listening. And I know you talked about this as well. Does the criteria take into account risk, namely hazard and exposure? Is safety or performance requirements that use these classified chemicals of concern that are required by code or standards in the US or elsewhere? How will EPEAT account for this? So two questions here then. So I guess, one is, are we considering risk or as opposed to just hazard? And are we recognizing safety performance requirements that may make certain materials necessary to use?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we take a hazards-based approach. So the chemicals that are known to have hazards are the ones that we focus on. We don't do a risk analysis-based approach, but we do incorporate elements of risk. So in the manufacturing process chemicals, for instance, we incorporate the likelihood for exposure and the elements of likelihood for exposure into those criteria. To answer the second question about different, if I understand the question correctly, different legislative drivers for managing chemicals, we really try to take the best in class regulations and policies that exist out there for all of our EPEAT criteria. And so while we might not cover every legislation that exists around restricting chemicals, we try to address ones that encompass all of the restrictions that might exist. And so we do that with some of the restrictions of particular substances and those covered by, for instance, ROS, as well as including elements of IEC 62474, which is an overview of chemicals that are within regulations and industry drivers for chemicals that might be in electronics products. So there are elements there of trying to be as comprehensive as possible without having tons of criteria for each particular region set of regulations.
Great response. Thank you, Rachel. Let me give you a break, and because I see one here about implementation, and some concerns about what is the schedule for implementation, when will it be published, what factors will it consider, and so forth. And so I'll take that one. As I mentioned, there's two sides. One is we know purchasers are extremely anxious to see updated criteria as soon as possible to meet executive orders and all kinds of policy objectives. At the same time, manufacturers need significant lead times, particularly if there are product design changes necessary. And so, as I mentioned, the EPEAT program is currently soliciting feedback on the implementation timeline. They're listening to all of these voices, taking all of that into consideration, and I expect that they'll have a finalized, more detailed plan by October, and we will share that immediately. And I think we have time for another one, so let me go ahead and there's a question about Rachel, I think this is an easy one for you. Are any of the chemical of concern criteria only applicable to a certain product category, or will they apply to all of our product categories?
Yeah, so the majority of our criteria across the modules apply to all ICT product categories. There are instances in other modules where there might be a table for different goal setting for different product category types. In the chemical of concern criteria set, there are no provisions for different product categories. So this is an issue that came up during the expert ad hoc group, that there were some concerns expressed about different product categories meeting criteria. And we encourage, if there's more thoughts on that people submit public comments around what those particular concerns might be, if there needs to be a case made to differentiate criteria for different product types.
Fantastic. I believe we have addressed the questions that I can see in the window here. And thank you for these questions. They're terrific, and we hope that you will participate in the public comment period. It's a very important part of the process. So I guess with that, if we could go to the next slide. This is where I get to say thank you. So to all of our attendees, thank you for attending today's webinar and for all the great questions. Later today, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording and the slide deck. The email will also include links to the NSF online platform, the draft criteria, and the state of sustainability research. So again, thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the rest of your day.